Oh, good afternoon, everyone. You folks look familiar. Have we met before? No, couldn't be. I haven't been in Victoria since 1941, when they put me in Catholic Cemetery number 2. My name is James McKnight. I was born in Port Lavaca. My father was born in Ireland. He was a building contractor. I learned from him. Mainly, I worked in stone and brick. In those days, most buildings were made out of wood. Now, someone handed me this book on the way up here and said that I would like it. And I can see why. Many of the buildings that I worked on are in this book. You might know the O'Connor Proctor Building, corner of Forest and Main. One of my favorite projects, one that still stands today. Looks a bit different today, wouldn't you say? The awnings are gone. It's had many signs over the years, Hyde's, the Squire shop, many things were in this building. I constructed this building for Mr. T.M. O'Connor and members of the Proctor family. I came to be great friends with the O'Connors and the Proctors. Here's another piece of my work. Now, architects tend to get all the glory, but the contractors are the ones that really do the work. And this is one of my great pride and joy projects. You may not recognize this if you were, say born after the 1970s, because around 1978, this magnificent building was torn down. Now, as I said, I became great friends with the O'Connors and the Proctors. I did such a good job on that building that Mr. O'Connor asked me to build him a 3-story building with a basement just across the street. So, today I believe there's something called One O'Connor Plaza in this place. But back in 1897, Mr. O'Connor purchased this property, had some plans drawn up. I believe it was a Mr. Leffland that did those plans, one of those architects that everybody remembers. Not a lot of people remember J.F. McKnight. But I began work on this building, 7 a.m., with a crew of 16 men. And I tell you what, it was big news at the time. The newspaper reported on our progress, on what I was doing, what my crew was doing. You know, a lot of things stay the same. We had to get lots of permits. We had to ask a lot of permissions to build this in 1898. I had to go to the city to ask to be put into the city's plumbing system. We had to get permits for the plans. We weren't sure if we were going to be able to put a basement in this building, but we were. And it just so happened that old Charlie Karsner needed some dirt on his place, so as we were digging out the basement, we would just haul the dirt over to his place and he would use it. Quite a nice setup. So the photograph you see here is at the corner of Main and Forest. So the long part of the building overlooked Main Street. The short side overlooked De Leon Plaza. So you had great views of downtown, right in the heart of downtown. And I tell you, there were some great times had at that building. Today you might call it a multi-purpose space. There were office spaces upstairs, and it was the place to be when it opened. Members of the O'Connor family had their offices in this building. There was, what would I call him? A quack. That's right, a quack. A Dr. Brown moved in, a man who took out ads in the paper saying that he could cure whatever you had with no medicine, guaranteed. A quack. But as I was saying, a lot of things stay the same, but you tend to think that things that happen in your day are new and exciting. But I tell you, I do recall in 1898, shortly after this building opened, we had a ladies' organization from, I believe, the Baptist Church. We're having a bazaar on the first floor. Like I said, multi-purpose space. First floor had some wonderful event space in it. So the ladies were having this bazaar, but they didn't have a kitchen. So there was this, I think, a genius, a black fella named Jim Herod, who had what he called a mobile food kitchen. And so during this bazaar, he parked his mobile food kitchen behind the building, and they would just bring the food that he was making right inside. Now that sounds familiar, doesn't it? A mobile food kitchen. But I heard somebody talking earlier about this craze with food trucks. It's a new thing? I think not. Unfortunately, my beautiful brickwork, those iron balconies, were torn down. But I will say, another one of my favorite projects, the Welder Mansion. I told you I was in good with the O'Connors. Well, I was in good with the Welders too. And I helped construct John J. Welder's mansion up at the head of Main Street in 1897. Beautiful, beautiful building. Unfortunately, it was torn down as well. What a showplace it could have been for Victoria. This brings back memories. As you can see, my work on the O'Connor Proctor building on the right, Mr. O'Connor's new building there on the left, and even further to the left, some of you might recognize what's under construction, El Rancho Theater. You might recall it burned down in the 70s. I didn't have a hand in that building. And you know, many people that look at old photographs think that it snowed a lot more back then because there's so many pictures of snow in these people's albums from over the years. But when you think about it, and I hear you've got fancy new phones that you can carry around with you and even take pictures with them, but what's the first thing people in South Texas tend to do when it starts to snow? You go out and take pictures. So this particular picture was taken in 1940. And as I said, you can see the O'Connor Proctor building. You can see the T.M. O'Connor building. And in the far background, you can even see the top of the Welder Mansion. I love this photograph because it's got so much of my work in it. I had a family. I married Henrietta Little. We had 6 children. And as a matter of fact, Henrietta's childhood home is for sale at the moment. Now, the interesting thing about this particular house, you may not recognize it. If you've heard of the Bronson School over on Power Avenue, you've been by this house. That photograph was taken right before Bronson School was taken. It would have been right across the street there. But the turret, looks like a beehive, was blown off in a 1942 hurricane, and they never replaced it. So today, it's a much shorter, angled piece that does not resemble that. And it's the John and Henrietta Little House. My wife was named after her mother. I called her Etta. Now, when I died in 1941, my Etta lasted 2 months after I passed, and she was laid to rest in Catholic Cemetery number 2, right next to me. So I must go see her now, and I bid you farewell. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Lizzie Owens, and I am the daughter of Elizabeth McNulty Owens, who is one of the earliest pioneers here in Victoria, Texas. Now, when I was a little girl, there were 12 of us little children in the family, actually, Mother used to sit us down when she was tired of us and tell us stories about her girlhood here in Victoria. So I thought I'd come out and tell you some stories about what it was like to be some of the first people who lived here in our town. Now, Mother arrived in 1829. That was the year that her stepfather, James Quinn, found out that you could get land in Texas if you would come down and join a colony. So he arranged to be part of a colony near Refugio, and he left with his family from New Jersey, and they sailed around on the ocean and landed at right about near Rockport today. And there, Mother got off the boat. She was only 2, and the whole boat just sat there on the sand for a while. They put up a little camp. But unfortunately, cholera struck almost immediately. After all that time on the boat, they were so dirty and uncomfortable. And Mother got her first taste of the difficulties of life in Texas when her baby sister died. A lot of Mother's stories had to do with disease. She talked about how when they moved to Refugio, they found a mission there and a church, and they moved into the church, and there were some mission Indians living right there as well, which just fascinated Mother. But she said the colonists brought smallpox with them, and almost all of the natives died. Now, many of her stories were about Native Americans, and some of them were really scary. There was the one she told us when she was 6 years old, how she and her little brother, actually I think he was a little older than her, she and her brother would go and take lunch to their father who was working out in the lands near Refugio. And they would walk through the prairie and take him a sandwich or whatever, and one day a Native American jumped out of the brush and grabbed her brother by the arm and announced that he would eat him right there. He said, "I will eat your heart because the heart of a white man is the most delicious morsel." A Mother was 6. She grabbed a hold of her brother. She screamed for her father, who came running with an axe, and he struck that Indian again and again until he let go. Mother also witnessed the bloody scalp dance of 1836 here in Victoria. Now, the family moved to Victoria in 1835 because her stepfather got some land in what would be Mission Valley today. And Victoria was just a collection of little houses, and there really weren't any grids laid out or anything. It was just some adobe houses, some mud houses, and there was a town square and a market square. Now, her father worked the land out near Mission Valley, and there were some Tonkawa Indians there, and they told him what happened. The Tonkawa were friendly, and they said Karankawa Indians had come to them and asked if the Tonkawa would be willing to join the Karankawa and murder Martin de Leon's wife. They hated her. I don't know why. And the Tonkawa, who liked the De Leons and liked the settlers, said, "Sure, we'll join you." And then they cut their bowstrings. They cut all the Karankawa's bowstrings. And the next thing you knew, the Karankawa had no weapons, and the Tonkawa killed them all. Then they scalped them, and they came to Market Square, where City Hall is right now, and they performed a bloody scalp dance. My mother was 8, and she sat right in the front row looking and seeing it all. Then she saw Mrs. Martin de Leon invite those natives to a big feast to thank them for saving her life. Now, you've heard of the Great Comanche Raid of 1840, right? Mother was there. She remembered it. She said by 1840, Victoria had become a little grid city along the high point along the Guadalupe. You still had market and town squares, but now you had stores and streets and street corners, and she said the houses were all clumped up together because it was still pretty dangerous here in Victoria, so people stuck together. And she said that one day they heard there was a commotion up in Spring Creek. And Spring Creek is right about where Evergreen Cemetery is today, a little bit out of town. Some people came running into town. They said, "There's natives in Spring Creek. They're killing people." And it turns out the people up at Spring Creek had come out of their houses one morning, and all they saw was hordes of Comanche just standing there. They ran into the brush around the Guadalupe River, which means they would have run into what's Riverside Park today. They hid in the brush. Some of them died on the way, and the Comanche proceeded to tear apart their houses, tear up their feather beds, steal their property, put on their clothing, you name it. Now, word got back to Victoria. There's trouble up in Spring Creek. All of the men got on their horses. They got on foot. The next dawn, they rode out. They were going to find the natives. They missed. The natives circled around Victoria. They didn't come through the heart of the city because the houses were clustered together for safety, but they did come through a little bit towards Market Square. Mother was safe, but she knew some of the people south of the city who were captured and murdered. And she knew people in Linville when that city was destroyed. She said it was just terrifying. You didn't know where the natives were going to be next. She heard all about it, but fortunately her house was spared. But she said the most frightening thing about being in Victoria early was when the Mexican Army came in 1836. She said that we'd heard all about the Texas Revolution. Her stepfather was a good revolutionary, and they heard that a Mexican army was coming to Goliad. Her stepfather packed everything, ran to Goliad to help Colonel Fannin defend. No one wanted the army in Victoria. Meanwhile, while the men took off, the women and the elderly, they packed up carts, and they got ready to flee because everyone was scared to death. So suddenly, she said, her stepfather came back. He didn't stay with Fannin. The men with families were released to come back to Victoria. He came running to their house and he said, we have to go. We have to go now. The army is on its way. So they packed a cart. They threw everything they had. He said, I'll get the oxen, and he couldn't find them. Someone else had them, or maybe they just wandered off, Victoria being what it was. So they couldn't leave. So they got into the back room of their adobe house. They had 3 rooms, and they heard the battle at Coleto Creek. They heard the guns stop. They didn't know what that meant. They sat in there. Mother had a candle. She was holding it in the fireplace with her body shielding the light so it wouldn't shine. And she said the Mexican army came the next day with guns blaring, bugles playing, and a Mexican officer took the front room of their house. And they cowered back. They didn't know what to expect. Turns out he was a very nice man, and his wife saved them. One night, several Mexican soldiers banged on the door of their house with their rifle butts and said, we want in. No one knew what they wanted, but they could guess. The Mexican officer's wife answered the door and told them to go, and they did. The Mexican army, she said, was terrifying. They murdered people right in front of her, which is probably why her memory is so strong. 7 survivors of the Fannin massacre came to their house, wild-eyed, she said. They had been running and hiding. They saw the adobe house. They came to the back door, and they begged for help. And Mother's mother stood up to them and said, you can't be here. She said, don't you know the Mexican army is occupying the city? If they find you here, they'll kill you. And if they find you in our house, they'll kill us. She chased them away. They hadn't gone 3 steps before Mexican soldiers shot 3 of them in their yard. The other 4 were captured, taken to town square, and were supposed to be shot. Fortunately, an officer's wife stood in front of them and said no, and she spared them. But again, the Mexican soldiers were mean. Mother's brother, the same one who was once almost killed by a native, he took water to the suffering men, the survivors of the Fannin massacre, while they were waiting to be executed. A soldier took hold of him and nearly choked him to death and told him to go. Even the rumor of a Mexican army coming through the 1830s and 40s was enough to make everyone flee. They would flee over to the Edna region, towards Texana, a small town there, and towards Red Bluff. They did this 4 or 5 times. One of those times, Mother nearly died. They heard a Mexican army was coming, just rumor. They packed up their cart. They had their oxen this time. The whole family fled east. They came to the Navidad River, and it was flooded. Mother said the water was up to the tops of the trees on the banks. But they were more afraid of the Mexican army than they were of the floodwaters. So they got on, their cart got on, the ferry tipped, the cart went into the water and was lost. Mother went into the water, as did about 5 other people. They were all going downstream. People were drowning around her. She was going up and down in the water, choking. A tree snagged her bonnet. She held onto the bonnet snagged on a tree. She was still bobbing up and down in the water. She was about to die. A man jumped in and saved her. And that's how Mother was saved from that flood. Mother had an eventful life, but she ended up doing very well. She married a New Yorker who came down to Texas to serve in the Texas Revolution, Richard Owens. Richard Owens made Mother rich. He had a brick manufacturing plant, and he built bricks for some of the houses in Victoria. He built a bridge across the Guadalupe River, and sometimes he got $40 a day from that. And he also built the first courthouse in Victoria. So Mother became famous and wealthy. But you know, it's interesting. She always had a soft spot in her heart for one place, for the cemetery, for Evergreen Cemetery. When we were little, she would line us all up with our rakes and our hoes, and we would march out to the cemetery. And every day we would straighten up and hoe and rake. And we spent our weekends out there as well, cleaning the cemetery and making it pristine. And I always wondered why. And one time she told me, the night of the Fannin battle at Coletto Creek, they were huddled in their house. She was terrified. There was a sudden, loud knock at their door, and they all jumped. And it was a young man, a courier. He came and he said, I need Colonel Fannin. I am looking for Colonel Fannin. I have to get through. I have a message from the east. Her mother said, you'll never make it through. You hear the battle? So he stayed with them. He sat near my mother, and they talked, and the sounds of the battle stopped. The courier got very nervous, and suddenly there was a gunshot right outside the house. He jumped up. He said, it's the invasion. They're here. They're here. He ran out the door, and another shot sounded right outside the door. He fell, and he dragged himself away. He died in Evergreen Cemetery. So maybe the whole reason we have this is because of Mother's memories. And now I've shared them with you. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon. How are we doing today? Today I am Vincent Sitterly Fritz, born 1888. My parents were Louis Fritz. That's me there. Handsome little fella. My mother was Rosa Sitterly. They were married in 1877 back at the German Catholic Church, which was later changed to the Lord's Church. Now, before I can say anything about myself, I have to talk about my parents. They were the greatest people in the world. This is Louis, also known as Uncle Louis. He ran a confectionery that he got from the Sitterlys, and he ran that on 1100 South Main. And he also had a confectionery in the courthouse, the old courthouse over here. Now, Uncle Louis, or Louis, my father, is the only one whose name is on the courthouse. A lot of people have never seen it. On the front steps, there's some of the steps off of Bridge Street, right there on the right, down at the bottom, outside the front door, it says, dedicated to Uncle Louis, my father. Now that came about because the steps started to wear out so much that he complained after he had his confectionery in the courthouse that they went and put a new set of steps in there and tagged his name there. He was big into other organizations, but one of the greatest organizations he helped start after Mr. C.R. Alden was the Victoria Volunteer Fire Department. Started that early or late in the 1880s and carried it on for 12 years. He was the chief. He was also a member of the Catholic burial cemetery group that took care of that one. Can't talk about him much, but my mother, Rosa. Now that's her there, Rosa Sitterly. She was also very active in the Catholic Church. And she was also very active in the Ladies Auxiliary Fire Department group. They were actually some of the help us raise money for individuals, raise money for the injured firemen, raise money for equipment. And so we cannot say enough about them. She was in the Catholic Mothers Club. She was in about 6 organizations. So now you see where some of my following comes from. Other than being my greatest love was my mother, it's the Victoria Volunteer Fire Department. This is our house at 105 South, but it's no longer there, and was right down from the old sheriff's office. Now, it's no longer there. Here's a picture of me in the confectionery. That's me with my little head sticking out over here. That's one of my sisters, because there were 6 kids in the family, 3 brothers and 3 sisters. So as you can see, I started out as a businessman early in life, but mainly I started out as a fireman. With my dad's support, when I was 15 years old, I joined the fire department. Let's leave this one here because I was also a salesman, and I need you to read this one because this just shows how good a salesman I was. Feed you've been looking for, propagated from a seed found in King Tut's tomb. Horses neighs for it, cows bellow for it. The most fattening and satisfying feed for livestock in the world. Our horses win every race because we feed them only Felger's liniment seed hay. In fact, with the use of this feed, it is necessary to use 4-leg brakes to make them stop running. All right, that was from the Rose-France stables. Caution, feed this hay only in the wide open spaces because if fed in barns, animals may become too fat to get out. Vincent Sidderly Fritz, Special Agent. So there's some of my salesmanship that I went on to be. But the fire department, I became a junior fireman at 15. At 17, when my first opportunity, I became a real fireman and with the volunteer fire department. At 22, I was the chief of the fire department. And that's where my career began. Here I am, I'm second assistant vice president, assistant chief. M.L. Potash, the chief. A lot of great people made up that organization in the volunteer fire department. And it carried on and on. I was there when this 1916 opened the new fire station, Central Fire Station. It still exists. It's 2 blocks down. So go by and take a look at that one. You see all them new trucks. They're very new from the 1920s. And we had to buy each and every one of them. There's another shot of the fire station. And it's still there, and hopefully it's going to be there for a long, long time. Here's a group of fellows sitting out front. Notice on the far right, you'll see a guy looks like he's wearing a rubber coat. Well, he is. That's the equipment we use. Remember the ladies' auxiliary for the fire department? They help purchase those types of uniforms, gloves, and whatever we needed for us. So, and we grew and grew. I became a member of the State of Texas Firemen's Association, and I was also the head of the firefighters group that was upgrading the equipment. We had to standardize everything because back then the fire trucks were different, the firefighting equipment was different, and we had to really get everybody on the same playing field so that we can make a better response. Houses in Victoria were built out of wood, and a lot of them had what they call a balloon structure. And what this means is the outside walls had no fire stoppage between the ground and all the way to the roof. That worked as ventilation to carry the heat from the walls, so the heat from the outside wall did not get to the inside wall. Now that's great for ventilation, but that's not great for fire. So that type of ventilation is very, very hard to fight whenever that starts. You can see the high price there for a new fire truck back in 1911, I believe it was. So it's about $1,500. So it's a nice truck for $1,500. Try to buy one now. So that's from the American LaFrance Fire Engine Company. Still in business, still selling fire trucks. Now, as I said earlier, I was a very busy man. I was a chief for 36 years. I enjoyed every bit of it. My father had been chief for 12 years. This is some of the communication with the France company when we bought the truck. Now, I've told you about the fire department. It is still growing and still going strong. We had some of our first hired employees for the fire department were not firemen, but they took care of the horses that actually pulled the wagon and took care of the equipment. They had a secondary job of cleaning up city streets, but they found out they couldn't do both. So they paid them directly just to take care of the fire station, the horses, and keep them ready because we had pulled our wagons with horses. Prior to that, we pulled the wagons by hand. And we would have to have races. We had races in between fire departments about who had the fastest runners. And they would get out there and make a block who was the fastest fire truck before they were trucks. So the horses really helped us out. Here's one of our first ladder and pumper trucks. headed down one of the Victoria streets, and you can see how we had to get to the fire. If you didn't go straight from your house to the fire, you went to the station, jumped on the truck, and rode. Wasn't very safe, but we had to fix that over the years. But that's a piece of equipment. Here I am standing on the right with the bow tie and the white hat. That's the chief's hat. That's my father standing next to me, and that's 1946. Now, the Victoria Fire Department didn't pay firemen until 1948, and that's when my father died. So I guess it broke his heart that his volunteers went to full pay. But there were some great guys. I had a pretty good attitude. People liked me. I was kind of jolly, busy all the time. Reverend Joseph Patrick Cole pins an Irish shamrock on me. I was an honorary Irishman several times, even though I was Fritz. I was a German. But I was telling you just how busy I was. At one point, I had stock. Everybody knows what the stock exchange is. I had stock in 89 companies, all the way from Campbell Soup, Houston Light and Power, General Motors, General Electric. What else? I had Pearl Brewery. So you can see I was well spread out there. And these weren't just one or two stocks. I had it was anywhere from 3 stock to 14,000 stock. So I was a very busy businessman. I'm going to read a little bit of itinerary here, because it's such a long list of things I was involved in, because I inherited this from who? Mama. So I actually helped start the Magnolia Petroleum Company, where I worked until 1958, Victoria Bank and Trust. I was the director there. I had farming stock in Calhoun and DeWitt County. I was chairman of the Victoria County Democratic Party for 30 years. I was co-founder of the United Charities of the Victoria, later called United Way. So where did I have time to get married? I never got married. But I did keep my civic action. I was Victoria Civic Association, American Red Cross, St. Mary's Catholic Church Building Committee, St. Joseph's High School Board of Education, Victoria Chamber of Commerce. I was a 3rd degree Knight of Columbus. I was a member of the American Legion. I was a board of directors for the Power Home, which is still in existence. I was an honorary member of an all-ladies society, which was the Daughters of the Confederacy. There was only 2 men ever given that title. I was also involved with the Victoria Art League. I said I was an honorary Irishman, and I enjoyed that one. I was president of the Texas State Firemen's and Fire Marshals Association. And in 1966, the Salvation Army Senior Citizen Award was given to me, and that was 2 years before I had an accident in which I actually had a heart attack in the car. Now, when they went in and looked at my 3 boxes from the safe deposit boxes from the bank, they discovered a lot of stuff I had there. I left no will. So that was drastic to my family. My nephews and nieces had received everything I had owned. So I wonder what I would have done with all my money or stock or things if I had made a will. So think of that when you go home, and let's make sure that we get our property to those that really need it and could use it. And I'm pretty sure my nieces and nephews, they found things like an 1866 nickel in there. I had if I can pronounce it right, Deshawn pipe. It was pipe made out of white clay, and they're usually very ornate. I had 5 Mexican gold coins in there, and then another old nickel. So you could see I collected the things that I enjoyed and things that people gave me. So, but I have to tell you also that we have the Victoria Fire Department is doing a 150-year anniversary. We really want you to go out and honor those firemen. They're out there every day, the EMS people. And I'm very proud of what we have built here and very proud of what they can do in the future. And I thank you very much for you coming here tonight to listen to our stories. Thank you.
How's everybody doing this afternoon? My name is Catherine Fleming McDowell Bronson. Heavens, what a mouthful. Most of my friends call me Kate. I'd like y'all to do the same. I was born in Gainesville, Alabama in 1846, a year after Texas joined the Union. My mother died when I was 1 year old, and I went to live with her brother, Uncle Thomas Newton Fleming, and his wife, Molly. Uncle Thomas would become a great cattleman in Victoria and would be known for breeding fine livestock. Has anyone ever heard of Fleming Prairie? It's located in the southern part of the county. My uncle owned most of that. In 1849, we moved from Alabama to Texas, arriving on a schooner at the port of Indianola. There was not much to recommend Indianola at that time, but a few miles north was a little community known as Green Lake. Green Lake was named for a nearby tidal lake of the same name. About the same time that we arrived, some wealthy planters from Kentucky also settled in Green Lake. They built large and expensive homes and established cotton plantations. It was a good childhood. Uncle Thomas and Aunt Molly were kind to me, and there were a lot of neighbor children to play with. I still remember the 1851 tornado that hit Green Lake. We were very lucky. There was very little property damage and no injuries. But then things did change with the outbreak of the Civil War. Federal troops were camped nearby to be returned to the North. We did entertain General Robert E. Lee at my uncle's home. Sadly, after the invasion in Texas of the Yankees, they took over our house and used it as headquarters for the officers. They destroyed everything when they left. We left to avoid the Yankee invasion and took refuge in San Antonio, but I never returned to Green Lake to live, partly because I had met a fine young man, Mr. John Bronson. Mr. Bronson had served 4 hard years during the Civil War with Terry's Texas Rangers, but his uncle, Jesse Obadiah Wheeler, encouraged John to settle in Victoria. So in 1866, he did just that and opened a grocery store. But that wasn't what he wanted to do. The years following the Civil War were very difficult in Victoria. Reconstruction was a heavy yoke. There was very little money, and the trade out of Indianola had dwindled to a trickle. Additionally, a severe yellow fever epidemic hit Victoria the next fall, 1867, making Victoria a sad place of death and grief. But it was that same fall, October 1867, when Mr. Bronson established Bronson's Bank, Victoria's first exclusive tech banking institution. 9 years later, he would expand the company, change the name to J.M. Bronson and Company. He took on new capital and new associates. Bronson's Bank would eventually become First Victoria National Bank. In 2013, it merged with Prosperity Bank, and local ownership ended. Not a bad run for a bank, no? Not a run on. Oh no, Bronson's Bank was very good during the Great Depression. It was one of the few banks that was allowed to reopen with few restrictions. John was an astute businessman and wildly successful. On August 23rd, 1870, we married, and I got to join him in that success. We became very wealthy and enjoyed all the comforts life afforded us. We hired the noted Texas architect Eugene Heiner to design and build a magnificent home for us on Staten Avenue. It was luxuriously appointed and had all the modern conveniences and was perfect for entertaining. The house stood until 1934, when it was dismantled. I do miss my home. Mr. Bronson and I were unable to have children of our own, so we adopted a daughter, Ethel, and a son, John. There they are. They both married and gave us grandchildren. Mr. Bronson served as president of the bank until 1905, a year before he died. He was remembered as an entrepreneur, a philanthropist, and a community leader. After his passing, I sold our lovely home and moved a few blocks away to live with a first cousin. I will survive 26 years after his passing. I donated land on West Power Avenue to have a public school built and named in honor of my late husband. I do believe Mr. McKnight told you some more about the Bronson School. It stands today. I also bequeathed my estate to establish a home for children in need, the Bronson Home, that was established to provide food, clothing, shelter, education, and to see after the welfare of the children and their religious upbringing. It was always my wish and my vision that the Bronson Home not be considered an orphanage, but a home, and that all the children are family. On March 12th, 1932, after a long and full life, I died on a Saturday morning after an extended illness. The papers said of me that I had been a civic citizen for half a century and one of Victoria's most charitable citizens. Wasn't that nice? Because of the enormity of my estate, it took 5 years to settle it and for the Bronson Home to be built and open. Even though my lovely home on Staten Avenue is gone and the bank has a different name, there's still a lot of Mr. Bronson and me around town. I've heard there's a neighborhood just adjacent to the new college called Bronson Terrace, and there are some streets in that neighborhood with names like Catherine Circle, McDowell Street, and Milton Street, my husband's middle name. It was a lovely, wonderful life. And there's also Bronson Park on South Laurent that's been beautifully maintained, and of course, the Bronson School and the Bronson Home. Thank you all so much for your time and attention. Have a lovely afternoon.
Zidrovna. My name is Anna Karanak Laser. I was born in 1877 in the ghetto of Warsaw. You see, my family and I, we are Jewish. And in Warsaw, that's where all the Jews live, in the ghetto. In those days, Warsaw was part of a land that was always fought over by the Ruskies and the Dutch. Life was very hard for the Jews in Warsaw. We work hard, but the money that we earn, it goes for the taxes to the Kaiser or to the Tsar. We live in fear of the long swords of the Cossack soldiers who come to our ghetto often, and they bring with them pain and fear and blood. I married my husband, Jakob Laser, when I was just a young woman. He was an apprentice to the cobbler in the ghetto. He was known for his skill in making things with leather, the shoes and the boots. All the Russian officers They wanted him to make their boots, and they would line up in his store to give him their orders. I thought Jakob, he was the bravest man in Warsaw, because when the soldiers talked to him, he stood up straight and tall. And when he talked to the soldiers, he looked them straight in the eye. Something not many Jews dared to do in Warsaw. Jakob and I, we wanted a big family. But after we had our first two children, Morris and Jetta, I sensed that he was worried. He was concerned. We knew that there was a war coming, a war so big and so bitter that every country in Europe would be involved. A war that would make Warsaw a battlefield. Jakob wanted us to leave, to go to America, as so many others were doing. We had saved some money, but it was not enough for the four of us to go. So after much talk, we knew what we must do. Jakob must go on to America alone. He must work and he must save. And when he could, he must send us the money to come to him. And the children and I, we must wait for him in the ghetto in Warsaw. And so in 1913, Jakob leaves. He takes a boat for the cows, and he comes to Galveston in Texas. The immigration laws for America, they say that Jakob must have $10 in his pocket so that he can pay his own way until he finds a job. And Jakob, he has his $10. But on the boat, he gets a haircut. And that costs him 25 cents. He does not have $10 anymore. And he worries that they will not let him into America. The boat goes to Galveston. Jakob lines up with the others. And when he gets to the gate, he shows them in his money. They wink at him. They laugh. And they send him on through the gate. And Jakob thinks, oh, America is good. Jakob finds a job in Galveston. He is a shoemaker. He stays there for only a few months, though, because a hurricane comes, and Jakob is frightened. So he travels north, and that is how he comes to Victoria. Again, he finds a job as a shoemaker again, and this time in a shop on East Constitution Avenue. The shop, it is owned by two grumpy old men. They do not like each other much, and they do not like making shoes much. And so in just a few years, Jakob, he buys the shop, and he makes it his own. In a few more years, Jakob buys electric shoe repair equipment, the first in Victoria. And he renames his shop the Victoria Electric Shoe Shop. In the meantime, the children and I, we are waiting. We are in Warsaw, in the ghetto. I have another baby just a few months after Jakob leaves for America. A little girl, and we name her Leah. Jacob knows how to read and to write in Hebrew. I never learned. Papa says school is for boys, and husbands and babies are for girls. So the letters that Jacob sends us, my brother reads out loud to the whole family. I love hearing the words that Jacob sends, but it hurts my heart that I cannot read them myself. It hurts my heart that he cannot write any words, especially just for me, his wife, because he knows I cannot read them. But his letters reassure me that he is well and that we are moving closer to our dream of being together, all of us, in America. And so we wait, the children and I. We wait through the war. We wait through the poverty. We wait through the hunger. Until one day, finally, we received a letter that says, "Come, come, my family, come to me, come to America." Jacob works hard in Victoria. He builds his business. He builds his good name. He is a member of the community, and he has friends. He bought the first Liberty Bond that was sold in Victoria. When the community learns the story of our family, many of the good people in Victoria, they give money to Jacob, money to help us pay for our travel to him. And so, in 1920, by bus, by train, by ocean liner, we come to Texas, the children and I. But as our train approaches Houston, where we are to meet Jacob, we are rerouted to Bloomington. In Bloomington, someone calls Jacob in Houston, and they tell him what has happened. So Jacob gets on the first train he can find to Bloomington. But when he gets there, we are not there. We have taken a train to Victoria. So Jacob, he gets on another train, a train to Placido. And sometime before the train gets to Placido, Jacob gets off and he walks 14 miles until he finds us in Victoria at our house on Craig Street. A year before we came to Victoria, Jacob leased a brand new house on Craig Street. He worked so hard to make it ready for us. Every room has the furniture that we need. There is a box with ice in the kitchen, and it is filled with food. A new bicycle for Morris, a dollhouse for the girls, and in the driveway, an automobile, a Studebaker. And so we begin our life in Victoria, and it is good. In just a few years, Jacob becomes a citizen of the United States. I have 2 more children, and the children and I, we learn English. I learned to cook American food. There is so much food here, and I am such a good cook. I learned to make pickles from the cucumbers, And soon I become famous for the pickles that I make. I make pickles for the neighbors. I make pickles for the dinners at the temple. I make pickles for the restaurant downtown. Do you know that restaurant? It's still there. Fasati's restaurant. I make all their pickles. They serve them with every plate of food. I am famous for my pickles. I don't know if I can make you understand how it was for us to leave the ghetto, to leave the one room where we lived with our family, to leave the hatred of Jews in Europe, to leave the war, the pain, the fear, the danger, and to come to these United States, to come to Victoria. We have our own home. We go to temple. We have friends, Jewish friends and Christian friends. We are safe. We can be together without being afraid. This is the blessing that is America. And life is good. In time, our 5 children give us 13 grandchildren. We are blessed. We go to temple on Friday nights. On Saturdays, we go to the movie pictures downtown. We watch the Andy Hardy movies with that handsome young man, Mackie Roney. On Sundays, we go to Riverside Park. We take picnics with fried chicken. Our grandchildren, they go to university. And not just the boys, our granddaughters, they go to university too. Life is so good. We are so happy. We know our children, our grandchildren, they have a future that could only happen here in America, in Victoria. I died at Dieter Hospital in 1955. It was my heart. 6 years later, Jakob joins me. And now we are together. We can't be separated anymore. We still like to visit the places that we loved in Victoria. His shop, the park, our temple, our house. Do you know our house? It is on Craig Street. It is owned by the Foxes. They are such nice people. But she don't cook so good. So sometimes I leave her a jar of pickles.
Good afternoon, everybody. I came out here with instructions. My wife Antoinette, who you're going to hear about in a little bit, told me, don't embarrass me. Whatever you do, do not embarrass me. I am Alexander Adams. I was born and raised in Norfolk, Virginia. And my father, Alexander Adams, and my mother, Susan Slayton Adams, coincidentally, they were both born in 1776, which gets to my grandfather, who was born in 1740 in Coronary House, Ireland. He was the first to come to the colonies and came in as an indentured servant. He found the woman that he wanted, and he chased her, as he said, chased and courted your Grandma Agnes until, as she puts it, I was so embarrassed and I said yes. He enlisted and fought in the Indian Wars and the American Revolution, for which he received huge parcels of land in Hopkins, Kentucky, where my father was born and raised, which leads to me. I had a few missteps in my life. I married Priscilla Jones in North Cumberland, and we had a daughter. Married Josephine Adams, who is pictured right there. I brought her with me. As we trickled down the states, I found and married my Antoinette in Louisiana. We heard about Victoria, Texas, and decided to come here. When we got here, we fell in love immediately. Beautiful, fertile land, ample game, a country boy's dream. When we got here, though, people at that time were allotted 640 acres, depending on the time that they arrived, with the stipulation that you had to settle and work the land. Eventually, I came up with my own brand. So what we found out at that time, though, was that the Texas Revolution with Mexico was extremely, extremely bad. So what 800 of us Texans, with Sam Houston as our leader, decided to end it. We marched to the outskirts of San Jacinto, and then on April 21st, 1836, in mid-afternoon, we attacked them with cannon fire and attacked them so fiercely that the majority of them retreated. The battle lasted all of 18 minutes. Santa Anna was wounded, and 630 of his men and 7 of our fellow Texans died that day. And that was the end of that. When we returned, we found that the Indians had been attacking the city. So what we did is a lot of us moved out to the outskirts of the city and formed a perimeter to warn and protect the city. One of the incidents that's close to my heart is that Indians attacked our house, and my Antoinette saw an Indian run a spear right through one of our workers who had stepped right in front of her to protect her. After everything settled down, since I am a brickmaker by trade, I opened a brickyard with E.C. Clemens. The site was at the end of Staten Street. There's a little pump house there. I think there's a little restaurant there now. We worked the brickyard for years, and then eventually in 1848, we decided to sell to Richard Owens, a real good friend of mine. We had worked numerous projects together. We actually built the Wheeler House together. Richard's bricks were used to build the Phillips House, who was a congressman here at around that time. Chances are, walking around here, you might be able to see 1 or 2 bricks with Owens' name on it. Victoria was booming at this time, and all of us contributed in some way or another. I was an alderman numerous times between 1844 and 1859. There are a few things that I can remember there, decently entertaining, I would say. The first one was that we authorized, in 1845, we authorized J.O. Wheeler to hire people to clean up the community, which brought up the pesky taxes. The businesses had to pay $5 to $10 amounts every quarter to pay for the work. Another law that came about was the dog law. Any dog running around the street had to have a tag with the owner's name on it. It infuriated so many people that it was later changed to where all they had to do was muzzle them. One of the good ones was that with me and Wheeler was still mayor, and me and my buddy Richard as alderman with a few other guys decided to build a 40 by 50 foot courthouse, which was built on the prison courthouse square. One of the biggest ones, though, was a $50,000 bond issue that we came up with to buy capital stock in the San Antonio Mexican Railroad. The bonds were never issued, but the railroad heard about it, and since they were going through their reorganization, they decided to run the railroad right through our place. One of the most entertaining things that I can remember was in 1858 was Elijah Bennett built a floating girth. He built 2 flat-bottom boats, 4 feet apart, and put a water wheel in between them. The current would turn the wheel and it provide power to the city. Everything has to come to an end. I lived my life to the fullest. I helped Victoria to the best of my ability. I passed away peacefully in my Antoinette's arms on June 30th, 1865. In 1867, my Antoinette and my brother Oliver, while helping the people with a yellow fever epidemic, succumbed to the sickness and died. All of us are buried at Evergreen Cemetery next to each other. Thank you.
Hallo, ich bin Peter. Or Peter. People around here, they used to only call me Black Peter. Never understood why, I guess the complexion of my skin. I'm pretty sure somewhere way back when I have a poor ancestor that was conscripted by the Spanish Habsburgs when they were occupying Die Niederlande. But I don't remember much of my home back there. Just faint memories of Das Rheinland. Now, I do recall around the early 1840s, there was a group of aristocrats. They started a colonization company called Verein zum Schutze deutscher Einwanderer in Texas. And we just called it Adelsverein for short, or the Society of Nobles. Several decades earlier, there was some German explorers and travelers that had came to survey and see the vast reaches of the Texas frontiers. And they fell in love with the central area of Texas at that time, which I think you in the land of the living know of as the Hill Country. So they went back home, expositing wondrous and fanciful tales of a wild Texas ready to be tamed and settled. Now, the Adelsverein, they launched a huge advertising campaign about the project. There was signs in the streets, articles in the paper, travel books for sale everywhere. There was a genuine excitement amongst Germans about staking a claim in wild Texas. We even used to casually and jokingly greet our family and friends with, "Geh mit ins Texas," go with us to Texas, instead of like Guten Morgen oder Guten Tag. In the Adelsverein, they were paying a handsome, generous sum for any persons or families willing to face the unknown and relocate to Texas. And that's about the most of what I remember back home. Like I said, faint memories. But this place, Victoria, I've got vivid memories of this place. It was 1845. The first group of ships with the Adelsverein German settlers, about a few hundred or so, came to port in Karlshafen, which you all are probably more familiar with as Indianola. It was actually named after one of the Adelsverein, Prince Karl von Solms-Braunfels. They landed and made their trek up north, following the Guadalupe River. And they finally came and settled their first two settlements, Neue Braunfels, after Prince Karl, and Fredericksburg, named after another of the Adelsverein, Prince Frederick Hohenzollern von Preußen, or Prussia. But it was 1846. That's the year that I remember. Second wave of Adelsverein German travelers came into Karlshafen. 5,000 Menschen, 5,000 of them. Now, one of the sales pitches of the Adelsverein was that all of your food, shelter, supplies, and support were going to be there, and that all you needed to bring was your closest, most prized possessions and that which you needed to restart in Texas. The Adelsverein was going to take care of the rest. But when those ships came to port, they were met with nothing. Nothing but a bare Matagorda beach in the humid, muggy, rainy South Texas spring. And when the rains came, they weren't prepared for that. So it didn't take long before sickness began to set in. And they weren't prepared for that either. And their situation quickly got worse. So many died on the beaches of Matagorda Bay. I remember reading Dr. Ferdinand Rehmer's travel account, Texas, some years later, and he wrote that 1,000 died on the beaches. Now, those that were able to move had no choice but to do so, facing further sickness, disease, and death. They set out north along the Guadalupe. And as expected, many more died along the way. Dr. Rehmer wrote that of the original 5,000 that came into Karlshafen, no more than 1,200 made it to either Neue Braunfels or the Fredericksburg. Now, Victoria, this was the first settlement that those travelers would come across. And imagine that. A small settlement, struggling itself to endure during the same humid, muggy, rainy South Texas spring. Suddenly, unexpectedly, burdened with an unfathomable amount of starving, dying, sick foreign travelers. The situation quickly overwhelmed Victoria. Food, shelter, supplies, all the resources were strained. But then there were the deaths, because they didn't stop dying after all. And as they came, and the diseases that came with them, well, those spread too. So the growing dead presented a growing need to bury that dead. That's where I come in. That's my story, because that's what I did. I was a grave digger, just over at our first cemetery. Now, as a grave digger, I mean, you're used to the dead. I was used to the dead. But what I wasn't used to and what I wasn't prepared for was death on such a grand scale. I dug so many graves, so many poor German souls that had left their comfortable, familiar life in Germany, chasing a frontier fantasy, only to die before ever seeing that promised land, only ever knowing a hellscape. Victoria at the time, they paid me a shot of whiskey for each body that I buried. And I'll tell you, I needed the whiskey back then. The dead weren't going to stop dying, and I actually made more money at that time than I ever made in my life, because the city of Victoria also paid me $2.50 along with each shot of whiskey for all the bodies that I buried. Some thought I got paid too much. In fact, the mayor at the time, Mayor Rogers or something or another, he came to me and said, "Oh, budget cuts and what they are and yada, yada, yada. But, we're gonna have to lower your pay." And I thought, who the hell else is going to bury all these people? Him? Ha! So you know what I did? I took one of those poor German corpses, and I propped it up against Mayor Rogers' storefront door. So the next morning when he went to open it up, pop! That corpse fell right on him, took him straight to the ground. I'll tell you what, the city of Victoria suddenly found it in their budget to pay me what they had agreed to. A few years later, there was an outbreak of yellow fever or something or another in New Orleans, and so people aren't going to stop dying, and so work took me out of Victoria, and I never came back. But that was my life, burying the destitute and abandoned German settlers and all those who succumbed to the disease that came with them in this part of Texas. It's been centuries since then, but even in death, I will never forget the countless German souls that I interred into the ground here in Victoria.
Good afternoon. My name is Laura McDonald Sutton. And if that name rings a bell for you, especially for those of you from Cuero, well, it should. And I'd like you to know right up front that I am still angry about what happened on March 11th, 1874. And that was the day they killed my husband. The day my husband was shot down like a dog in Indianola. My husband was Willie Sutton, and they all said he was a good man, soft-spoken and kind. He was a good Texas man, too, born in Fayette County. Moved to DeWitt County in 1850 with his parents. And when the Civil War came, Willie enlisted, as a good Texas man did. Fought for the Confederacy. And then, when it was over, he came back to DeWitt County to settle down to do some ranching and some farming. And that's when he ran into those Taylors. Now, those Taylors, they thought they owned the place. They came out of the East, they said, in the early 1800s. And they settled in DeWitt County to be ranchers, and they also rounded up maverick cattle, and sometimes they rounded up other people's cattle too and put their brands on them. Those Taylors, they said they settled down south of Clinton and Cuero, Texas, along the Guadalupe River, and those Taylors, they liked to fight. Old Creed Taylor, the patriarch of the family, that man fought in the Texas Revolution. He fought at San Jacinto. And when the Texas Revolution was over, he fought the Comanche. And when the Comanche were gone, he fought in the Mexican-American War, and he enlisted in the Civil War. And they said, if you had a fight, you had a Taylor. Those Taylors, they were good people, probably. They were good people in the early days of Texas. But something happened to them after the Civil War. Those Taylors got a hatred going for all things Yankee. They hated the Reconstruction government of Texas. They hated E.J. Davis. They hated the Union soldiers that came to DeWitt County to occupy the place. But mostly they hated anybody and everybody who worked with the carpetbaggers. Now, my husband, on the other hand, he came back looking for opportunity. I mean, the war was over. He had nothing. He wanted to settle down in DeWitt County. He wanted to be a rancher. He had some trouble with the Taylors every now and then for picking up cattle and labeling mavericks when they were his cattle. But my husband, he believed in law and order, and he also understood that opportunity after the Civil War meant getting along with the Yankees. So he did. My husband joined the sheriff's department in DeWitt County, became a deputy sheriff, and in 1870, when E.J. Davis created the Texas State Police, well, my husband volunteered his services, and soon he had 200 men under his command. Now, those Texas State Police, I don't know about them. They had a license to do anything to keep law and order, including a license to kill, and I guess something started happening to Willie the longer he got in with those Texas State Police. I know that he had trouble right off the bat with the Taylors, because with my husband on one side, with the Yankees and law and order, and the Taylors on the other, well, there was no doubt they were going to come to violence together, and when they did, they called it the Sutton-Taylor feud. My husband's side versus the Taylor side. They killed 22 of them, 13 of our side, and destroyed the town of Clinton, Texas as well. The feud lasted from 1868 to 1876. Took Texas Rangers to shut it down. What started the feud, you might ask? I don't really know. Willie told me that it started in March of 1876 when he was chasing some horse thieves out of DeWitt County. He chased them all the way up to Bastrop, and he found them on the streets of Bastrop, and one of them's names was Charles Taylor. He shot him dead in the streets of Bastrop. The Taylors, they told a different story. They said, no, that wasn't it. They said it was the day that he shot Buck Taylor. Buck Taylor was a big name in the Taylor family. Buck Taylor and my husband came together in the town of Clinton for some reason. Some said they were doing a horse deal. Some said they just hated each other and they'd shoot on sight. But for whatever reason, my husband killed Buck Taylor in the streets of Clinton, Texas, and the Taylors said that was it. That was the beginning of the end for them. Now, after that killing, it got worse and worse. A pretty vicious guy named Jack Helm came into DeWitt County to keep law and order and be part of the Texas State Police, and when my husband got with him, things started going bad. My husband did some things that weren't altogether Christian. Jack Helm believed in hunting down Taylors because he thought they were criminals. So in August of 1870, he and my husband and a bunch of other people in a Sutton posse, they went down south of Clinton to Taylorland, a place where all the Taylors lived. They went to old Pitkin Taylor's farm, and they found Henry and William, two of Pitkin Taylor's brother or sons-in-law. They arrested them on some kind of charge. They said that they had been disturbing the peace or something. I don't know. Rumor was those Texas State Police arrested people on all kinds of reasons. Rumor also was they never brought people back alive. So they arrested these two men, and one of their wives said she knew what the Texas State Police were like. She knew that her husband would never get to the jail alive, so she followed them. And she said she watched her husband sit down on the ground in a clearing, pull out his pipe and reach down to strike a match off the bottom of his shoe. And she said at that point, my husband shot him in the back of the head. Then she said the rest of the posse shot down the other man. And she went around and told everybody who would listen that it was cold-blooded murder, and that's all it was, and that the Texas State Police were assassins. And it just got worse from there. Now, old Pitkin Taylor, this happened off his farm. Old Pitkin Taylor raised hell about the loss of his sons-in-law. He told everybody he was going to get back at those Suttons. So in the summer of 1872, he woke up to hear the sound of a cowbell out in his farm. He thought the cows were in his corn. So late at night, he went out there to drive those cattle away. It wasn't cows in the corn, it was gunmen, and they shot him. Pitkin Taylor took a while to die, but eventually he did, and had a big funeral for him. And when they did, they started a rumor that my husband and the other Texas State Police were having fun and drinking and laughing and cheering at the death of Pitkin Taylor. Now, I don't know if that's true either, but that's what they said. And over that old man's grave that night, those Taylor boys made a vow. They said they would find my husband, they would shoot him, and they would wash their hands in his blood. Well, it wasn't long after that they were hunting my husband. Young Jim Taylor, that was Pitkin's son, he vowed he would find my husband, he would kill him. He hunted him wherever he went. He found my husband in the summer of 1873 sitting alone in a bar, a saloon up in Cuero. Young Jim put the barrel of a shotgun through the front door, pulled the trigger and missed, but it sent my husband a message. They tried again in the streets of Cuero a couple of months later. They tried to shoot him again. They couldn't do it. Then they enlisted a very dangerous man to help their side, John Wesley Hardin. I know y'all have heard of him. John Wesley Hardin was a killer. He killed Jack Helm, the sheriff of DeWitt County, killed him dead. Killed a couple of deputies too. And with John Wesley Hardin aboard, those Taylors, well, they took that feud out of Clinton and Cuero and they expanded it to Yorktown and Thomaston and all over DeWitt County to where you couldn't even go outside without having a gun. You couldn't walk down the streets. Everybody had to take a side. Now, Willie had done some bad things in the Sutton-Taylor feud, there's no question. But Willie was at heart a kind and gentle man. In about 1874, Willie married me, and I was 17 at the time, and I got pregnant, and I was starting to show about 4 months later. We were terribly excited. We were having a baby. We talked about would it be a girl or a boy. We didn't care. And I told Willie, it's not going to be long before Jim Taylor finds you. He's always looking for you. You've got a target on you. We need to get out of here. And he agreed. He said, we do. He said, I don't want to be doing this anymore. I'm done with this feud. I don't want to be a part of this. So we moved back to Victoria, where my family was, but we still didn't feel like that was far enough. Wasn't either. So we talked some more, and he said, what I'll do is this. I'll send a head of cattle up to Kansas City. And then we'll take a steamboat out of Indianola. We'll find those cattle up in Kansas City. We'll go over into New Orleans, and we'll take some kind of wagon up to Kansas City, and we'll start our lives up there. And maybe we'll come back to Texas, and maybe we won't. But we're going to end this. We're not going to be a part of this anymore. So I agreed. I said, that's a good idea. So here I was, 4 months pregnant. We got on a wagon. We brought Gabe Slaughter with us because we needed another pair of eyes out there on the road. And we went down to Indianola. And you know, Indianola was a big town back then. It had railroads and industries and docks and lots of people, and we thought we'd be safe down there. So when we made it to Indianola, my husband, he put his guns away. And Gabe Slaughter put his guns away as well. We thought we were safe. We walked on the docks, and there was our steamboat, the Clinton, sitting right there waiting for us to get on, and I felt my heart relax for the first time. We got up on that boat, and we stood out on the docks, and we felt safe for the first time in a long time. And then Gabe Slaughter stiffened a little bit, and he said, look there. Isn't that Jim and Bill Taylor on the dock over there? And my husband said, yes, it is. And Gabe said, well, hadn't we go for our guns then? And my husband, I don't know why, but I remember it to this day. He said, no. He said, don't worry. Jim and Bill, they're too much men to start anything here. And I don't know what that meant. Did it mean that Jim and Bill thought there were too many people around? Or did Jim and Bill think it was just unthinkably cruel to kill a man in front of his 4-month pregnant wife? I don't know. But Jim and Bill Taylor did get on our ship. And they walked down the deck and they found us. And right in front of me, Jim Taylor put a bullet in my husband's skull. And he put another one through his heart. And Bill Taylor turned around and fired 2 shots into Gabe Slaughter's face. And they both died right there. And I was hysterical. I was pregnant. My husband was dead. I fell on my knees. I cried. I covered my eyes. They told me later what happened, how Jim and Bill went over to my husband lying on the ground, and they were going to shoot him again and again and again until Mrs. John Kieran threw herself in front of them and shielded my husband's body and said, cold-blooded murderers, you let this man die in peace. And they did. They walked off the ship and they walked away, leaving me there with 2 bodies. We were trying to end this feud. We were trying to get out. We were trying to go back to being peaceful people. We didn't want to have any more people hurt in this. They thought differently. So as for me, I went back to Victoria. I let the feud escalate on its own. I wanted nothing more to do with it. I went back to Victoria, and I carried our child, and I gave birth to a boy, and I named him Willie Slaughter Sutton, because that seemed right. But I wasn't done. I also took out an ad in the local paper, and I offered $1,500 for anyone who could find those Taylor boys and bring them to justice. And I made certain people knew what they were looking for. I pointed out these Taylor boys were filthy and dirty, and they spoke in low tones and had a low countenance. I thought that served them right. So I want you to remember my husband who tried to get this to end as we leave here. But I also want you to remember something else. I've got $1,500 for the man among you who can bring Jim Taylor to the Cuero County Jail. or who can put him in the ground. Thank you.